What if civilization has weather? Not only storms in the sky, not only heat in the atmosphere, not only droughts, floods, and changing seasons across the earth, but inner weather, moral weather, psychological weather, cultural weather, civilizational weather. What if societies, like landscapes, move through patterns of pressure, turbulence, fog, lightning, warming, cooling, and renewal? In Garden of Wisdom, I call this the consciousness weather map. And I believe it is one of the most important ways to understand the age we are living through. Because if we look honestly at the world, it becomes clear that history is not driven by events alone. Events matter, of course. Wars matter, elections matter, markets matter, technologies matter, ecological disruptions matter. But beneath all of them, there is something more subtle and more powerful, the emotional and spiritual climate in which people interpret reality. A society in fear does not hear the same facts the same way a society in trust does. A culture in resentment does not use technology the same way a culture in responsibility does. A generation raised in anxiety will not imagine the future the same way a generation raised in depth and belonging will. So the question is not only what is happening in the world, the question is what kind of consciousness is the world happening inside? That is the core idea of this talk. Now, weather is a useful metaphor because weather is both real and dynamic. It changes, it moves, it gathers force, it passes through regions, it affects what becomes possible. When a storm moves through a landscape, certain actions become difficult. Visibility changes, movement changes, danger changes. What once felt stable becomes fragile. The same is true in the inner life of civilization. There are times when collective consciousness is marked by panic, times when it is marked by cynicism, times when it is marked by ideological rigidity, times when it is marked by restless ambition, times when it is marked by moral fatigue, and sometimes, though more rarely, times when it begins to open into greater clarity, compassion, courage, and integration. These are not vague moods, they are civilizational conditions. And in Garden of Wisdom, I argue that if we are going to navigate the future wisely, especially in the age of AI, we need something like a consciousness weather map. We need a way of reading the patterns moving through humanity so that we do not mistake every storm for destiny or every burst of energy for wisdom. Because one of the great dangers of our time is confusion between signal and weather. A frightened population may call fear realism. An angry culture may call agitation truth. A distracted society may call stimulation freedom. A highly accelerated civilization may call speed progress, but weather can distort perception. And if we do not know what kind of weather we are standing in, we may misread everything. That is why inner climate matters. Now let me make this practical. Think of fear as a kind of atmospheric pressure. When fear rises across a society, people narrow, they become reactive, they seek certainty, they become more vulnerable to manipulation, they are more easily divided into tribes, they tolerate surveillance more readily, they prefer control to complexity, they often reward leaders who promise protection rather than wisdom. That is not merely a political phenomenon, it is a weather pattern of consciousness. And when fear remains long enough, it becomes climate. A civilization begins organizing itself around it. Its media reward outrage. Its institutions normalize suspicion. Its technologies are designed for prediction, control, and behavioral management. Its imagination shrinks. In that kind of weather, even brilliant innovations can become dangerous because they are born inside a storm system that turns everything towards self-protection and domination. Now, think of another kind of weather: confusion. Confusion is like fog. Things are still there, but they cannot be seen clearly. Direction becomes uncertain. Voices blur together. Truth loses sharpness. People become more dependent on external guidance because their own orientation weakens. Does that sound familiar? We live in an age of informational fog, an age in which more content does not always lead to more clarity, an age in which endless commentary can produce paralysis, an age in which synthetic media, algorithmic amplification, and emotional overload can make it difficult to distinguish the meaningful from the manipulative. That too is consciousness weather, and if we do not name it, we are likely to mistake fog for reality itself. But Garden of Wisdom does not describe consciousness only in negative terms. There are also warmer currents, there are openings, there are moments when empathy grows, moments when awareness deepens, moments when societies begin sensing the limits of domination and the need for cooperation, moments when ecological consciousness expands, moments when people grow tired of spectacle and begin searching for truth, moments when a wider field of care begins to emerge. These are the first signs of changing weather, the first signs that a civilization may be moving from fear toward responsibility, from fragmentation toward integration, from restless competition toward deeper participation in the whole. And this matters immensely because one of the central claims of Garden of Wisdom is that consciousness evolves, not automatically, not without conflict, not without regression, but genuinely. Humanity moves through stages of awareness, and those stages do not only exist in individuals. They move through cultures, institutions, technologies, and generations like weather fronts. Some systems arise from survival consciousness, some from tribal identity, some from power and conquest, some from order and certainty, some from achievement and expansion, and some begin to open toward wider compassion, systemic awareness, planetary responsibility, and more integrated forms of life. The consciousness weather map helps us see where we are in that movement. Not perfectly, not mechanically, but symbolically and diagnostically. It helps us ask what pressure systems are shaping the present, what storm fronts are intensifying, where is there heat without light, where is there awakening without grounding, where is there clarity beginning to emerge, where are new climates of consciousness struggling to be born. These are not decorative questions, they are strategic questions for civilization, because if you misread the weather, you build badly, you design for the wrong conditions, you prepare for the wrong future, you overestimate stability, or you miss the window for renewal. That is true in ecology, and it is equally true in human consciousness. Now, in the age of artificial intelligence, this conversation becomes even more important. Because AI does not arrive in neutral weather. It enters whatever emotional and moral atmosphere a culture is already generating. If the atmosphere is anxious, AI will be used anxiously. If it is competitive, AI will intensify competition. If it is extractive, AI will become another instrument of extraction. If it is fearful, AI will be turned towards surveillance, prediction, and control. But if the weather begins to shift, if consciousness matures, if wider responsibility grows, if societies begin valuing care, wisdom, and long-term flourishing, then AI can become something else. It can become a forecasting tool for civilizational health, a support for ecological restoration, a way of sensing patterns too complex for ordinary perception, a partner in helping humanity see what kind of climate it is generating. This is one of the more hopeful possibilities in Garden of Wisdom. Not that AI saves us, but that AI may assist a more conscious civilization in becoming aware of itself. Imagine that for a moment. A civilization capable not only of tracking markets and military threats, but of tracking the emotional and moral patterns that precede social collapse. A civilization capable of sensing rising fragmentation before it becomes violence. A civilization capable of detecting when fear is being artificially amplified. A civilization capable of noticing where trust is healing, where empathy is spreading, where communities are becoming more resilient. That would be extraordinary. But of course, it raises a serious question: who gets to define the weather? That is crucial, because the map itself must not become a tool of domination. If powerful institutions begin labeling populations as unstable, irrational, regressive, or dangerous without humility, then the language of consciousness can be weaponized. It can become another means of sorting humanity into superior and inferior categories. That would betray the whole point. The consciousness weather map is not meant to shame, it is meant to illuminate. It is not meant to produce spiritual elitism. It is meant to produce responsibility. It reminds us that everyone lives within weather. Everyone is affected by atmosphere. Everyone can be pulled downward by fear or lifted by a wider field of love and light. So the goal is not to condemn people for being in a storm. The goal is to understand the storm well enough to respond wisely. That distinction matters, because if consciousness is weather-like, then compassion becomes part of navigation. You do not hate a storm. You prepare for it. You learn from it. You protect life within it. And you build differently because of it. That is a deeply important shift in how we understand social tension. Instead of asking only who is to blame, we can also ask what weather system has formed here. What long pattern of pressure produced this eruption? What spiritual drought preceded this moral fire? What hunger for meaning made people vulnerable to distortion? Those questions do not remove responsibility, but they deepen it. They allow us to act more wisely because we begin seeing causes beyond the immediate event. And this brings us to another crucial distinction: weather is not climate. This is one of the great lessons of inner and outer ecology. A sudden storm does not define the whole ecosystem. A wave of panic does not define the full human story. A period of confusion does not mean awakening is impossible. A reactionary phase does not mean consciousness cannot evolve. Too often, societies mistake temporary turbulence for permanent identity. They say, this is just who we are, this is just what humanity is. Fear, greed, conflict, domination, that is all there is. But Garden of Wisdom resists that despair. It argues that while storm systems are real, life also carries a deeper tendency toward growth in love and light. This does not mean naive optimism. It does not mean denial of evil. It does not mean history automatically bends upward. It means something more demanding: that life offers potentials for higher consciousness, but those potentials must be chosen, cultivated, protected, and embodied. The map helps us recognize where those possibilities are emerging. Where are people becoming more capable of complexity? Where are communities learning cooperation? Where are institutions beginning to think long term? Where is ecological awareness deepening? Where is spiritual maturity becoming more public and less performative? Where is the human story widening beyond tribe and fear? These are signs of changing climate. And they matter because civilization is not transformed only by grand theories or major inventions. It is transformed by subtle shifts in what large numbers of people can feel, imagine, and hold. When enough people become capable of deeper responsibility, the atmosphere changes. Different leaders become possible, different technologies become desirable, different stories become credible, different futures become thinkable. That is the practical power of consciousness, and perhaps that is why our age feels so unstable. We are living between weather systems. The old climate is breaking down. A great deal of human organization is still shaped by fear, domination, speed, extraction, and spectacle. But another climate is trying to emerge, one shaped by interdependence, regeneration, consciousness, cooperation, and care. These climates overlap, they clash, they generate turbulence. That turbulence is not meaningless. It may be the sign that the transition is underway, but transitions are dangerous if they are misread. If people interpret instability only as collapse, they may rush back toward authoritarian certainty. If they interpret awakening as mere trend or performance, they may trivialize it. If they confuse intensity with transformation, they may exhaust themselves in endless emotional weather without building enduring structures of wisdom. That is why the map matters. It gives us a way to see more clearly, not to predict everything, not to control the future, but to orient ourselves within change. And orientation is everything in a storm. So, what does wise orientation look like? First, it means learning to read the weather without becoming the weather, to notice fear without surrendering to it, to notice confusion without worshipping certainty, to notice social heat without becoming incendiary, to notice fragmentation without feeding it. That requires maturity. Second, it means building for climate, not just weather. If we want a wiser civilization, then we cannot respond only to each crisis as it comes. We must cultivate deeper conditions. Education that forms discernment, technologies shaped by compassion, institutions that reward truthfulness, economies that serve regeneration, cultures that widen the circle of care. That is how climate changes, not by slogans, by sustained formation. Third, it means accepting that weather systems are relational. My inner life affects the collective field. Your inner life affects it. Leadership affects it. Technology affects it. Storytelling affects it. Architecture affects it. Ecology affects it. Nothing is isolated. This is why Garden of Wisdom connects consciousness to the larger living universe. We are not separate minds floating above reality. We are life forms inside a living web. The weather of our consciousness affects how that web is treated, and the condition of that web affects consciousness in return. So the map is not only psychological, it is ecological, spiritual, civilizational, even cosmic in implication. Because if life is moving toward greater consciousness, then every weather pattern is part of a larger drama. The tension between contraction and opening, between fear and love, between fragmentation and resonance, between lower and higher forms of being. And that brings me to the deepest question: what kind of weather are we preparing the future to inherit? What atmosphere are our children breathing? Not only chemically, but morally. What pressure systems are our technologies intensifying? What storms are our institutions normalizing? What climates are our stories making possible? If we do not ask these questions, then we may become highly advanced in our tools while remaining primitive in our atmosphere. But if we do ask them, honestly, courageously, with humility, then we may begin to cultivate a civilization that is not only more intelligent, but more stable in consciousness, more coherent in purpose, and more aligned with life. That is the hope of the consciousness weather map. Not perfect control, not spiritual fantasy, but wiser navigation, a civilization that can read its own storms, a humanity that can sense when fear is rising and choose not to enthrone it, a culture that can notice when awakening is real and nurture it rather than commodify it, a future in which intelligence serves not only reaction but orientation toward higher forms of life and awareness, because in the end, the weather of consciousness shapes everything else. And if we want to change the future, we must learn not only to build new systems, but to cultivate a clearer sky within which those systems can become worthy of life, as above, so below. In Garden of Wisdom, I argue that humanity's future depends on whether we can read the weather of consciousness wisely and choose to cultivate climates of love, clarity, and responsibility strong enough to guide civilization through the storms of change